This evening, we will be taking a dive into how we can promote safer spaces for us all to exist in. The 16 Years of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is an annual international campaign that kicks off on the 25th of November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and runs until the 10th of December, which is Human Rights Day. It is an opportunity to call on international community, governments, local actors, and all of society for the prevention and elimination of violence against women and girls. And this year, the theme for 16 Years of Activism is Orange the World. So you can see I'm wearing orange, and it looks at ending violence against women now. And this year's theme is particularly important for the Caribbean, as COVID-19 has presented unprecedented challenges to our small island developing states. And during this pandemic, violence against women has manifested in different forms, including domestic violence, online and information and communication technology facilitated violence. So looking at the cyberspace, which we will get into this evening. And as we continue to grapple with these economic and social impacts of the pandemic, coupled with the looming threat of natural and environmental hazards, it is really vital for us to recognize the disproportionate impacts on women and the most vulnerable within our society. So tonight, we are joined by two phenomenal individuals who are working with their organizations and agencies to forge a safer future for women and girls and to promote healthy relationships that advance gender equality. We are joined by Erica Martin, Labor Standards and Labor Law Specialist at the International Labor Organization, and Muwkawil, poet, activist, and lead musician at Freetown Collective, and also plays an integral part in the Love Over Everything movement. Good night, Erica and Muhammad, and welcome.
Good night.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yes, it's truly, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we're gonna get right into it. And I wanna throw this question to you, Erica. I know that we've all been hearing sexual harassment and, especially looking at our current context in the workplace, being a type of public space also. What is sexual harassment in the workplace and how can employers tackle this issue?
Great, no, thank you so much for your question. To start, and it's such an important place to start with what does sexual harassment mean? Because to really generate a discussion, we need to have a common understanding and a common language that when we speak about sexual harassment, people do understand exactly what we're talking about and why it's unacceptable. As you mentioned, I work for the International Labor Organization, and we are a tripartite organization, meaning that it's the coming together of workers, employers, and governments to discuss these issues. And most recently, one of the things that these tripartite partners come together to do is to develop international treaties on issues in the world of work. The most recent international treaty adopted is on specifically violence and harassment. And one of the most discussed and negotiated aspects during the development of the convention was specifically the definition of these terms, because it comes, different countries have different legal approaches to this issue, use different terminology, and it was very important for them to have common language to use to discuss the issue, but also to make sure that the definition was comprehensive enough to cover all forms of unacceptable behavior. So the way that it is defined is as a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices, or threats of an unacceptable behavior or a practice. And it can be one time or it can be repeated. And it's not just about the intent. It's either it has the aim or it results in economic harm or sexual harm or physical harm. And it's very important there that when we talk about sexual harassment, it's not necessarily that it's done with the intent, but that it does have the result of physical psychological or sexual harm. And it does, of course, include gender-based violence.
Thank you so much for your response. And I think it's very important for us to understand, and have that common ground in understanding sexual harassment, because that's where sometimes the lines become blurred. And so I want to bring in Mohammed here. I know that, many times we hear in society, especially within the Caribbean, that, street harassment, sexual harassment is our culture, right? Do you think that catcalling and street harassment is we culture?
No, I mean, many will say yes, right? Because it's what we've all seen growing up. But I think that culture is fluid. If culture wasn't fluid, we'd be in a lot of problems. We've made giant strides away from the culture that we used to have. If we were speaking back in the 1940s, 1950s, Caribbean, or indeed the world, we would still be talking about women not being able to vote or hold certain types of positions, and everyone would have just said, well, that's just the way it is. That's just culture. And what I think we are beginning to see is, as those norms changed, the larger ones, the attitudes and behaviors kind of went subterranean, right? In some ways, and they embedded themselves so they could remain there. And they exist now in these subtle ways that are not so subtle, but we accept them as culture, So a woman passing by a group of men expects to be called that. There's a nervous response in the bodies of women who are passing close, and you hear it all the time from women, They will avoid construction sites. They will avoid places that men congregate because they know that when they pass there, they're going to get this type of response. And on the side of men, there are many men who exist in groups like that who think that it is some kind of rite of passage to do this. And if they don't do it as men, then they won't be seen as they won't be seen as manly within their group,
And that is so important. I love that reference to thinking it's a rite of passage, because there are a lot of things that we tell men that they should be, and how they are socialized, and having that prowess and that dominance and that control is something that we see happening a lot. And so, Erica, I know that, from your experience in the workplace, do you see culture as, something that, I guess, fuel how sexual harassment happens in the workplace?
No, thank you. I definitely, it's culture, and then also norms and gender norms. And I think what was so important about what he said is that it's not just, the stereotypical role that or the stereotypes or the gender roles assigned to women, but it's also the toxic masculinity that is also assigned to men. And what we have seen in approaches to addressing violence and harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace is that it is necessary, of course, to have prohibitions, to have policies, but if you do want to address it and to see fundamental change, it is about addressing the underlying factors, which do include deeper things that are more deeply ingrained, like you referred to. And I think that then recognizing that, just having a surface level approach is not going to be sufficient to actually rooting out the problem and, getting towards a place where we do have workplaces where people are able to be free of sexual harassment.
And I just want to stick with you for a moment, because yesterday there was a panel discussion, and there was a vox pop, and one of the participants, it struck me, and I just had to giggle a bit, because the guy was talking about, women want men to be kind, but then when they compliment them when they're walking on the street, they are upset about it. And so, looking more at the root, I know that sexual harassment, it's a matter of power and control. And so do you think that is actually it? Do you think there are other factors that come into place, especially in the workplace, that see women and girls as more vulnerable to be, on the other side of sexual harassment?
No, I think you said it so eloquently. I mean, so when the International Treaty Convention number 190 was developed, one of the things that is recognized right at the top in the preamble is that, to address the issue, you have to look at underlying causes and risk factors, and those include gender stereotypes, but also gender-based power relations. And it's one of the reasons why so many of us are so excited about this new international treaty is because to see, the recognition of the role of gender-based power relations in it's a reality for so many women and girls all around the world, and I know in our region, but to see that reflected in language in an international treaty that can be binding when ratified. And so that power relationship is unfortunately a huge contributing factor. It's not to say that sexual harassment is always it's not always a boss to employees. It can be lateral violence as well. And it can also, it can also be from an employee to someone in management or exercising supervisory responsibilities. That is, of course, also covered by the convention. Bosses, supervisors, they also deserve a world of work free of violence and harassment. But when countries are coming together and bringing their national experiences and studies done in their country, one of the risk factors that was identified was, for example, it's not always the case, but one risk factor that greatly heightened the risk for workplaces with higher occurrences of sexual harassment, for example, are workplaces where there are men in management, and then most of the non-managerial functions are performed by women. That's not all workplaces like that, I want to be very clear, but there were some empirical studies that did identify that as a specific risk factor, which is just a more concrete way of saying when power relations enter into the equation.
Most definitely. And I love that you provided great examples and various examples, because sometimes we think it only goes one way from top to bottom, but not understanding that it can happen across, it can happen from bottom to top, and really just trying to get to the bottom of it, even beyond power and control, but just understanding how we've been socialized, right? And there's so many things that we're surrounded by, and I think the pandemic has really, it has us in a spot where we are forced to face everything that's wrong. There's no escape, really. And so I'm bringing Muhammad in, and I know Muhammad as a poet and musician, and this is, I think it's like an argument that happens regardless of time, right? And I know you always talk about this. So when it comes to lyrics and music, right? Lyrics, the power of the tongue, words, it's something that really moves you if you internalize it well. And I think even subconsciously it does, right? But do you think lyrics and music play a role in promoting violence against women and girls in public spaces, specifically looking at us here in the Caribbean?
Yeah. The way in which we broach the topic of sex and sexuality, particularly the act of sex, human sexual interaction in terms of music, and how the music portrays it, and how a man should approach sex and how a woman should approach sex, and what the power dynamic is in terms of the approach to sex. Who holds the power? How does one display power during sex as a woman, as a man? What is it to be sexy as a man, as a woman? All of these things are defined in the urban space by music for all intents and purposes, because we aren't having national conversation on, sex and the power dynamics and all that. The conversation surrounding these things nationally and indeed in the world, it happens through music primarily, right? It is not happening in schools. It's not happening in public spaces where therefore are talking about this all the time. The most spoken about that sex is in music. That those spaces are defined for us by what the music tells us. And unless we have people in our lives, or we enter into spaces that can redefine those things for us, or we ourselves are doing the internal work and reading and trying to redefine those things, the majority of our information comes from music. That's what we hear all the time. So young people coming up, they have access to that type of information via the music and via their peers who are listening to the music. and via the culture, which has been informed consistently by the music. And so, yeah, it's a big factor. It's a very big factor. So in the mid-90s, when you had a large reggae movement, you know, with Sizzler and Capleton and whatever, there still weren't very many female voices, but you started having songs like from Sizzler, like Thank You Mama. There were lots of odes to mothers and that kind of stuff. And we began to see a different kind of approach for a little bit than we saw in some of the earlier dancehall. And now there's a pervading type of message of how a man should approach sex and how a woman should approach sex and what is sex within the power dynamic between male and female. So the music is pervaded by a singular kind of a message right now. And that singular message is what is drummed into our heads over and over and over again. And what I think we definitely have to do is either create more music that changes or allows us to discuss that dynamic in a different way, or have wider national discussions and have it in schools in a different type of way. So at least there can be a balance in the way that the thought process towards these things occurs.
Yes, that you hit the nail on the head there. And I know I've looked at a couple of interviews and heard different artists who say they used to sing positive music, but they had to switch up to sing the kind of music that they think people like, which is always, you know, very hypersexual, you know, objectifies women because that is what sells. And I will never forget listening to a soca. But I mean, we know music, we know a lot of music, some of the lyrics, when you really take it in, it's really awful. And I think when we listen to that music and we dance to it and we sing along, I always realize that, do we even have a culture of consent? And this is a question for both Erica and Muhammad. And I guess Muhammad, as you're already, you know, right here, do you think we have a culture of consent, and how do we get to that point of, you know, really having it there, you know?
I think when you're speaking about consent, you're first speaking about body autonomy, and you're speaking about the collection of a self. For someone to consent to something, in the truest form of the word, they would have had to collect themselves completely. They would have to understand what their likes are and their dislikes are, and you know, so it is possible to trick a child into consenting to something that they don't even want to do, but that child isn't emotionally mature enough. That child doesn't have the information in order to consent to something, which is why you have things like statutory rape and all that to protect children. But what about the adult who has been formed by a certain ideology or a way of thinking towards something, and they are now consenting to it, not knowing that this is not the best of this world that you can have. This is not the best approach to it. But because of how you have been indoctrinated in this particular way, this is what you are choosing. And we see many adults later on in life, when they get a little more wise, when they get a little more information, when they travel into the world a bit more and they realize, oh, there are other worlds that exist outside of what I have been trained into. And then they look back at the choices that they made, because they were choices. These are consenting adults, and they say, wow, that was madness. So consent is a real tricky thing, you know, at the very base of it. Are we collecting ourselves to the point where when we consent to something, the thing we consent to is in our best interest, right? You have to have the information for your consent to really mean something. Beyond that now, are we teaching our men and our boys really what consent is? You know, I heard it said once, Amanda C, she said, you know, anything other than a full 100 consent is not, you're not really having an experience as a man. If you're getting into something with a woman and the only reason she's sleeping with you is because she feels she's going to lose the relationship, or she feels as though, well, it's just time, or any other reason than I want to have this experience with this person fully, and I'm fully awake and aware of what I'm doing. Anything less than that as a man, you're not having a full experience. Yeah, you know, it's actually a problem. But so, you know, it's so tricky inside of there, you know? And so I think really letting our boys and our men know it has to be full, you know, and for that to happen, the person has to be comfortable. You have to have made them comfortable, you know, and sex can't be the thing that you're driving at all the time. So consent is a tricky thing. It's a very, very tricky thing. And then at the same time, it is not.
Yes. So many things there. And before I even respond, I want to hear Erica's thoughts on consent.
I don't know if I could have anything to add to what Muhammad said. He explored all of the facets, and I just just to say that I think, he really did cover, anything that I could hope to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. And of course, we've learned that consent has to be informed, but I've actually never heard it broken down in that way. So I really appreciate that, Muhammad. It really gives us, greater insight to really explore the role that we play in ensuring that people are aware of what consent is, and also seeing consent. And I was really happy that you brought in understanding consent with children. Because many times, and I think this is something that we've all had to experience, where you have that family member who comes over, you do not want to hug them, but then your parents are like, go hug. Why are you sitting on there? Go hug them. And there's a discomfort you learn that from young, that you have to give in public spaces, wherever that you are, you have to give in because you want someone to feel okay. So many times, I've heard this rhetoric about women smiling when they're catcalled. And people are like, oh, because they probably like it. But no, because they've been taught that they have to be nice and be kind, but also the fear of what happens after the catcalling, what happens after you ignore, what happens in the workplace when you turn down the advancements, and especially in the pandemic, which we'll get to, because I think even in that space, people are more vulnerable because people are losing jobs. And of course, there are different things that you give into. But there's a question that we got, and I'm excited to hear your responses. And I guess we can start with you, Erica, which looks at, do we teach children what consent is? And do you think that happens? And do you think it should happen, of course?
Do I think it should happen? Absolutely, 100%. I'm going to take off my lawyer hat now, and I'm a mom. I have a 5-year-old, and every day there's so many opportunities to teach kids from such a young age. I have a little boy, and I really think about, it's my job not to, you hear later when they're older, there's, dress codes, and, they're telling girls, they have to dress like this, and, they have to, but it's my responsibility as a mom to a boy to make sure that he understands that it's his responsibility to respect all of his classmates, all of his friends. And I've heard some, bad incidents, kids with parents of older kids where, their daughters are told to cover up, and it's never, their sons are told to just be more respectful. So I think it's essential. I think that whole thing about hugging, a family member, Christmas is coming up, Santa on the lap, if they don't want to do that, your body, your choice, and them understanding that at a young age. And, they think, oh, consent, how are you going to talk to kids about it? But them understanding that they have bodily autonomy. I'm hoping, he's only 5 yet, so I don't know how he's going to turn out, but I'm hoping that is, how we set the basis. On the other hand, when I'm struggling to get him, get him dressed in the morning, that's, I'm really like, no, you got, so I need to also practice what I preach. Are we doing it? I don't know. I do think that more and more though, and this is again, not as a lawyer, as a parent, you hear more and more about recognition that, stuff that, we were told as kids to do was important, about listening, about, I think there is more and more recognition of, how there are age-appropriate conversations about consent that you can have now, which it's, not just about sexual violence, but just about violence in general and respect on the schoolyard. But I don't have any answers. I'm just trying my best.
And that is the best you can do. Try your best. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for all of the work you're doing as a parent, but also, in your work, because that is so important, like it's one child at a time to, make the world better. So that's really, really admirable. Muhammad?
I was listening so intently. Could you ask me that question again, just like?
Yes. Sure thing. So one of the questions from the audience is, do we teach children what consent is, and how important do you think it is?
It's so important. I don't know if we, because when people say do we, I don't know who the we is. I come from a place where I as a child, it was identified for me that what we meant. I know what we means. I came from a community that was a very, very strong we. When I look at Trinidadian society, I don't necessarily see a strong we except in certain things. So I don't know if we are teaching it. Is it important? I think it's one of the most important things because it is the beginning of having a self, right? So the irony of it is you can't consent unless you own a self, right? You can't really do anything unless you own a self. And in order to own a self, you must understand consent, right? Because someone maybe, for instance, my grandmother always talks about when she was younger, she didn't like meat. She never liked meat. But at the time, the ideology was feed children and meat and they'll get strong, drink milk. And she never liked these things. And she was forced to eat meat. She was a left-hander. And, at that time, they say if you're a left-hander, you owe the devil a day's work. It's kind of madness used to happen in her time. And she would get beat on her left hand for writing with her left hand. So she didn't even have that kind of body autonomy in terms of what she wanted to eat or, writing with her own hand that she was prone to. And so when you have those kinds of situations, people come into the world expecting in a way to fall into the norms of what exists. And that's a very dangerous thing for us as a society, right? Because if the children who are the basis of our dreams, right, who are the ones who come into the world and see all the old things as new things, and then they dream a new world out of that, the world we will exist in. If we remove that from those children and we teach them that here's what, from very young age, you're going to conform to the norms and you don't have anything to say about it, speak when you're spoken to, right? Then we are literally killing the future, which we have no right to do, and that's how important teaching consent is. When we don't teach children that they have the autonomy to stand up and speak and say, no, I don't like this. No, I don't want this. My father always said that. He said when we were going to school, he told us, you can question with respect. Always question, but with respect. And I think that's the important thing. If something doesn't sit right with you, it doesn't matter if you're 3 years old or 300 years old. If it doesn't sit right, the person, the being is going to say, this doesn't sit right in whatever way. And for a young child, it might be crying. And for an older person, it might be to speak about it. But if we're not trained that we have the ability to do that, then we're in big problems.
Yes, my God. Your responses, both Muhammad and Erica, I'm glad this is recorded so we can go back and listen to it, because I think it's such a powerful, explanation and really exploration of consent. My hope and dream for us as a people is really transforming the way that we educate, because sorry, it's raining, so you're gonna hear rain. But yes, it's really transforming the way that we teach people that they should learn. And I think because from a very young age, they're taught not to ask questions, or there's a fear of saying, I don't know, or only speaking when you're spoken to. It really stunts the way that we learn. So we learn in ways that doesn't allow us to be able to express ourselves socially and learn, how to respect each other. We don't really learn respect. Like I haven't really learned respect in school, I can say. I know about how to dissect a plant. I know the parts of a plant. I know Pythagoras' theorem. But to say I learned how to be a decent human being, to respect people when I see them, to respect people of different backgrounds, to know that catcalling is wrong, to know that harassment is wrong, you don't learn that. And if we are to really have a future that allows for safety and security, we have to transform how we have education, a complete overhaul of the systems, And so shifting a bit, we're online, and we know that as society advances and we get new technology, of course, the types of abuse, that is something that also advances too. And so I know that, and I can start with Erica first, a lot of companies and organizations have moved to working from home. And so they're online, but of course we know that violence knows no bounds. And so it can still happen online. And so do you think it is harder to monitor and control that type of violence, violence in the cyberspace, rather than in a public tangible space in a workplace? And is there anything that can be done to ensure that employees are protected?
No, thank you so much for the question. I think it's such an important issue because the psychological impact of online harassment and abuse on victims of that is, I mean, you hear about how the impact is so intense. You know, you're in your home, for example, if, you know, you're having to work from home, or, you know, wherever you are, it should be a safe space. And then honestly, it feels invaded by, you know, the types of harassment or bullying you may be subjected to. So in some ways, the psychological impact of that for victims is more intense than something that, you know, that they might experience out in a place that, you know, is not a safe space for them. It's essential that it be covered. I've mentioned Convention 190 before, and I'm going to bring it up again because when the drafters got together to work on this, and I don't think I mentioned this, but actors in the Caribbean were so key in its development, were really some of the main authors and the main negotiators. And one of the things that they insisted be covered is work-related communication and ICT. And at the time, someone was like, oh, does that really, you know, is that really violence? Is that really harassment? And there were so many stories from workers and other people who said, you know, the immeasurable impact that online harassment had on their lives. And they made sure that it was covered because everybody, wherever you are, has a right to a world of work free of violence and harassment. And that covers online spaces, that covers the commute to and from work, that covers where you eat, where you take your meal, public spaces. And the huge increase that we have seen, unfortunately, in the move to a lot more digital work has also unfortunately meant during the pandemic a major increase in online harassment and online bullying. You asked if it's easier to monitor. I would say yes and no. So often, I mean, most often I think of it as something online. There will be written proof or recorded proof. And so in that respect, you could think that it is easier. On the other hand, I know that a lot of forms for online harassment are anonymous. I think we all understand that, you know, everyone, there is, you know, not everyone, but many people are much more courageous when they're hiding behind their keyboard. And the level of abuse and the language used, I think, is something sometimes much, when it's anonymous, is much higher than, you know, a worker would experience, even if they're in a customer facing role and regularly interacting with the public. So when anonymous behind the keyboard, the language, you know, that people are subjected to is honestly so degrading and disgusting. And I think the impact there. So it could in some ways be easier to monitor because there's often a record, but much more difficult to enforce. But I think it is then still important that measures be put in place to protect employees where possible from any form of online abuse or harassment.
Yeah, most definitely. And I really hope that we get to that point of ensuring safety of employees and everyone that exists in that space, regardless if they're online or offline. I know people usually say, oh, just log out or walk away from the screen, but it's not that easy. You know, everything has long-term psychological impact. And so I'm really happy that you highlighted that importance and of course the impact of it on people's mental health. So thank you very much. Mohammed. So this question, I mean, it's the same question, of course, not looking at, you know, workplace policy, but, you know, looking at the cyberspace and from your experience engaging people online and just, you know, monitoring, because we see it a lot. I think I'm on Twitter, so I see a lot of things that happens. Twitter is interesting. There's a lot of things that happens. And so do you think it is harder to monitor and control you know, violence in cyberspaces rather than in public? And do you, like, what do you think about that in terms of looking at public spaces, but also in the cyberspace?
Yeah, we take, you know, as a human race, but also as a people, I look at it with Caribbean people, especially in Trinidad, I see it so much. We love to penalize. So we always go to the problem at the very end because the optics are good when we penalize, right? You don't get very good optics from teaching a child not to do something, but you get really good optics from putting some handcuffs on somebody, or, you know, putting a spotlight on somebody that this person is an abuser or this person is an online bully or whatever. So the optics are better for those in charge when they can crack down. They show that they have some level of use, right? We spoke before about a self, right? But now people don't have one self. We have several selves spread across several platforms. So people have an Instagram personality, and there's a Tumblr personality, and there's a Twitter personality, and there's a Snapchat personality, and there's all these different, and there's a Facebook personality. And teaching people that they are responsible for their avatars, right? You are not completely disassociated from your avatar. You cannot just enact whatever you feel like. And the thing about avatars is that they tend to be a heightened presence. So whether it is a heightened shadow or a heightened light, it is a heightened presence of who we are. And learning to balance that so that we have healthy lives, right? Because you have people who have, they have issues in their lives and they're unable, for whatever reason, to deal with those issues in their lives. They don't know how to mitigate what they feel. And so they go online and they attack other people, or they portray things that aren't real. And so I think, again, responsibility for self, and indeed now for selves, because, you know, you're not free from the actions of your avatars. And as we move forward more and more into spaces like the metaverse and into more holographic spaces and all the different things that are going to happen over the next 50 to 100 years, the thing that we're going to have to start teaching children is that no matter where you exist, you have to exist kindly. You have to exist as yourself, you know, as your best self in whatever the space calls for, you know, when you're there. But it feels like such a playground because for a lot of us, the introduction to these spaces were games, and it's gone beyond games now. It's not Nintendo anymore. It's not PS5 and PS4. It's not any of those things. It's people's actual lives. There no longer is a separation. You know, people used to talk about technology as if it was some distant thing, you know, and interacting with technology. Technology is life now. And so we are responsible for avatars. We are responsible for however we show up, whether that be in reality or in a virtual space.
Yes, 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 yes. And I loved how you brought in children and kindness. And I think that is like the center of everything. Like when we think about violence, which I think a lot of people don't understand violence is, I think they always think it's physical and don't understand, like even Eric was mentioning it about people not understanding that violence can actually exist in a cyberspace. So I'm really happy that, you know, that was also included. But I think at the center of really, you know, promoting nonviolence and really working towards safety and security in public spaces and wherever we exist in is respect and kindness. And I think once we're able to do that and establish that, we will be in such a better place. It made me think about this, I mean, it's not new, but school-related gender-based violence. And that looks at violence within schools, right? And how people are targeted based on their gender in that school system. And, you know, people are existing online, it's online school. A lot of people are forced to be in those spaces. And so many people have such a hard time because some schools tell you that you have to have your camera on, and people are bullied based on where they live. They're bullied for a vast amount of reasons. And it's so important to teach kindness as a means to really try to combat you know, violent outbursts and how we treat each other, because we learn that as young people, and then we get older and we move into wider public spaces and we, you know, become even bigger bullies. And maybe those people go on to be heads of organizations, and then they use that power to, you know, harm others, or, you know, wherever they exist, they still cause harm. So I'm really happy that you both touched on that and really allowed us to explore the reality of that cyberspace too. And so sort of, you know, bring it back into a public space. And Muhammad, I will start with you. So I know that you play a really key role in Love Over Everything. And for people who are on and you are not familiar with the Love Over Everything movement, it's a movement that aims to motivate men and boys to reform behaviors that lead to violence, which is very important, you know, ensuring that everyone is included in this conversation. And so do you think, and this goes back to a point you were talking about with music. Now, a lot of people have horror stories of being in parties and fests and just going to concerts. And of course, this is pre-COVID, when we were able to go out, do you think entertainers and promoters have a role and responsibility in ending violence against women and girls? Looking at how they create those spaces, the FETs, do you think they have a role to ensure that people who are attending, their patrons, are protected, that they facilitate a culture of care and of consent? Do you think they have a role to play there?
Yeah, I mean, most certainly they have a role to play. Can we order people to do these things? Can we say, yes, they have a role and they must play their role? They have to come to a point where they realize that they have a role, because these are not things that you can do begrudgingly. These are not things that you can do halfway. You have to feel it in yourself. Otherwise, when you try to convey the message, it would just seem like a shell, you know, and we've seen this over and over again. With Love Over Everything, one of the approaches that we took, I never wanted to be where we just come and we just say to men and boys, don't do this, don't do that. You're bigger, you're stronger, don't hit. By the time you get to the point where you're saying to someone who is bigger and stronger and has the proclivity and the desire to go ahead and hit someone, you know, by the time you get there and you're sending a message to them that's that direct, I mean, I don't know what your margins are for success in that kind of case, right? So promoters and artists, if someone has built a career on singing music that is somewhat misogynist or heavily sexualized, right? To go to that person directly and say, this is the impact that you're having. And we think that you can do this or you can do that. That's one thing. We can't attack them. We have to sensitize people for them to realize the level of impact, because I strongly believe, especially in the Caribbean, a lot of artists don't understand the level of impact that we can have, because as artists, we are not valued for our intellect, generally speaking. And so many artists do not put forward their intellect as the primary way in which they want to interact with society. They make themselves intergesters. We sing songs that are full of gimmicks. And so people don't see us primarily as intellectuals. And so our intellectual opinions, our opinions on nationhood and these type of things aren't necessarily always sought out. And so the artist, in some ways, doesn't feel as though he or she has the agency to discuss these things. And I think speaking to artists and showing them, you actually do have the power to go beyond just standing up in a campaign and saying, don't do this or don't do that, but to sit down and conceptualize ways in which you can sneak messages into your music and still make it catchy and still whatever. You can directly attack things. You can sit and talk to your following. There's so much more that we can do as artists, you know, in the way that we collaborate with corporate sponsors or government or whatever to create programs to help these things. You know, as artists, we walk around and we see the world in a completely different way. And so our approaches to these things would be very different. So do we have a responsibility? Yes, we do, in my opinion. But you cannot shout at artists and tell them they have a responsibility when for decades, no one has asked our opinion openly. No one has put us as intellectuals. And I think the time has to come now where artists realize our intellectual contributions are, they're not only needed, they're necessary.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And I think even me, myself, have been on that side of thinking, like sometimes you see artists doing stuff, entertainers and promoters doing things, and it seems so performative, like, you know, why are you doing that? But I always try to remind myself that everyone has a role in the revolution. When it comes to advancing gender justice and ensuring gender equality, everyone has a role to play. Some people they might have a wider audience and they have a farther reach. And of course, you want to be able to buy into that, but you also want to position artists and entertainers as also voices in that movement, because they have a different reach. We all don't have the same audiences, and it's so important to tap into that. So thank you for sharing that. And I really hope people are listening and really also look into themselves too, to see how we ourselves would have contributed to that silence and placing, you know, people in boxes, because that's very dangerous if we're trying to, you know, advance gender equality. And so, Erica, I know, well, we all know that policies are part of it. It's not a means to an end. So what else do you think employers can do in whatever space they exist to ensure the safety of their employees? Like, what can they do hand in hand with the policies that exist, with the conventions that they ratify? What else can they do?
Luckily, so much. And I think it's when you, I think we all recognize violence and harassment in the world of work is a huge a huge, complex, multifaceted problem. And sometimes I think it feels so enormous that employers don't know where to start. But there are, luckily, I mean, concrete steps that can be taken by employers in collaboration with workers and their organizations to really affect change. So you mentioned policies, you know, policies at a national level, but one really important step that employers can take is the adoption of a workplace policy. A workplace policy saying that violence and harassment is not acceptable in their workplace, that has a zero tolerance statement. I know, for example, the Employers Consultative Association of Trinidad and Tobago has guidelines for employers that specifically has a model on, you know, what they can take, adapt to their workplace in consultation with the workers to then have a policy in place that does send a clear message. Beyond that, it's also, we often talk about risk assessments when we talk about occupational safety and health. And for occupational safety and health, it's kind of understood what that means. You know, you go into a workplace, you see the dangerous chemicals, the dangerous machinery, the dangerous, you assess that, and then you take measures to mitigate the risks. That same tool is now being used to address violence and harassment in many workplaces. And it's one of the tools piloted or championed in the ILO standards. So what counts as a risk for violence and harassment is different based on the specific workplace, but taking a systematic approach, examining what factors there are, who's most vulnerable, where those vulnerabilities are, and then taking specific measures to address that is something very concrete that doesn't require a huge framework, but does require thinking systemically about this issue. One last thing just at the workplace level that is very, very important is dialogue, is involving dialogue between the employer and workers on the issue of violence and harassment, whether that's if there is a committee at the workplace level to discuss that, great. If there's not, just making sure that that conversation is taking place. Often we have heard that at some levels in an organization, they're not aware of issues of sexual harassment that workers are facing, and that in having that conversation, they're made aware and then able to take more concrete steps. We also do look for reporting mechanisms, remedies, and, you know, confidential reporting procedures. That's all, you know, there are many other steps that can be taken, but in a nutshell, I think I would leave it there, and then also encourage anybody who's interested in finding out more information. They can look at the ILO Convention number 190. And I also know that as I mentioned before, the Employers Consultative Association has a lot of resources for employers looking to tackle violence and harassment at their workplace.
Thank you so much for that. And I really hope that there are employers, HR managers, people who are able to influence change, and even employees, for you to, you know, rally for this, because it's so important to ensure safety in the workplace, not specifically looking at, I know we always say, you know, protect women and girls, but it's not about protecting, but it's about creating these safe spaces, because no one should have to ever feel unsafe. We have to ensure that these spaces are safe for everyone to exist in, so no one needs protecting. And just to add to another question for you, Erica, do you think there are any barriers to actually enforcing proper workplace policy, like in companies, that they may struggle a bit to get to that point where they're able to actually offer these services and that type of space?
So one of the major issues is I think the stigma surrounding violence and harassment, and specifically sexual violence and sexual harassment in the workplace. I think it's very important. Confidentiality then is so important, and victim-centered approach is very important. But I think that, for example, sometimes when we think about unsafe work, you know, I know the OSH legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, you know, you have a right to remove yourself, you have the right to report that to your supervisor. And they think, oh, okay, this is an unsafe situation having to do with violence, we'll use that same mechanism. But because of stigma or sensitivity or if the person who is harassing you is your boss, you can't report that to your boss. And so sometimes, the basic reporting lines that you would have for other safety issues aren't applicable. So I think that that's a major barrier. I also think that lack of awareness is something that is changing every day. I think that more and more employers are realizing what is unacceptable. More and more workers are exercising their right. But I think even that, in the work ongoing to raise awareness on what is not acceptable in a workplace, what is not acceptable in our society. I think that does, unfortunately, there's still work to be done, but the work is being done by people much braver and much more eloquent than myself. And I'm hopeful, but I think that, awareness is still remains a barrier.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that, us learning that everything goes hand in hand. Raising awareness, also being educated, but also ensuring that there's legislation and policy and all of these things to match. Because if you can't, change things if only culture is shifted and there's no legislation, and you can't have legislation and culture isn't shifted, you're going to be hitting a brick wall. So it's so important to work in tandem in that way. And so I really appreciate that. And so as we're coming to an end, Muhammad, so many people are really, they want to learn. Some people do not know that they still have to learn. And you can't really know what you don't know if you don't know what you don't know. And so it's important to, I guess, surround yourself with people who know, but who also always interrogate the systems of oppression and the things that encourage us to engage in cultures that are harmful, that encourages violence against women and girls, that encourages catcalling, that just passes it off as culture and not really attempt to look at it deeper. So do you have any advice to men who are still learning, and for those who are not aware of the harm that is being caused and the impact of harassment and violence in public spaces?
Yeah. Listen. When you think you listen enough, listen some more. Because privilege is a word that's been thrown around a lot. And sometimes just being born as a man into a space is an extreme privilege. There are privileges that come with being born as a man. So there are things that men do not consider in the least. When a man is leaving home, he doesn't consider, well, this thing I'm wearing, where am I passing today? Do I have to take a taxi? I have what? No, a man just throw on their clothes and leave. A man having to come home late rarely considers, well, oh gosh, I had a pass here, or I had a pass there, dependent, right? And even then, the consideration is still not as deep as a woman who's on her own. So listen, because I said it yesterday, if you lose one eye, you lose depth perception. And if the human race is to be seen as a face looking outward, then the halves, the two eyes, we're men and women, how we see the world and what we see as the world is two completely different things. The things that we need from the world are different things. And if men are only thinking of themselves, or only think that what they think is what matters, for whatever reason, you have to stop and just listen. Even if the things you are hearing, you think they're things you've heard before, stretch yourself to just listen. If you listen long enough, you'll hear something else. You'll hear something in the way it's being said. So my advice to anybody who feels as though they may not be sensitized enough to the situation is to listen. And also to those who might be doing the speaking, if there are women doing the speaking, explaining to men what's going on with them. As much as people probably don't want to hear this, and there's so much dismissal within the cancel culture, etc. Men who are just learning, men who are coming out of something, even men who don't even know that they're coming out of something, but they have the ability to, which all of us do. People are going to say things you don't want to hear. People are going to say some of the most misogynistic shit you ever hear in your life before they come to a realization. And if you stop at a certain point, it's all going to go downhill. And I'm not saying that we have to, any woman has to advocate to the point where she's being disrespected, but she's still trying to explain herself. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if the situation arises where you do feel that you are safe to take the time and explain something to someone, then you may have to exercise a little bit of patience with them, as long as you feel safe. If your safety is being threatened, then forget that. But if you are in an environment where you can speak, sometimes we're gonna have to be a little bit patient with people who have not yet understood what the problem is, So listen and be patient.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. Listen and be patient. It's a journey. Learning and unlearning is a journey, a painful journey, actually. So as we wrap, Erica, when you think about a future that is safe and secure, and one where anyone can go into a public space and be comfortable, they can exist in a workplace and be comfortable, they aren't fearful that, there are going to be any sexual advancements for them to be able to get what they deserve in the workplace. What does that look like? A future of gender justice, a future of gender equality. What does that look like to you?
I'm so hopeful. For me, it's a world based on mutual respect and dignity. Everyone deserves mutual respect and everyone deserves dignity. And I'm honestly so hopeful for the future and excited about the future. I mean, you think about even discussions on sexual harassment 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, looked so different. I think that, very recently people would be like, oh, sexual harassment, is that discrimination? I'm not sure. And now so often, so many people, I have learned so much in the last 10 years, and I feel like a lot of people have learned a lot in the last 10 years. And right now we actually do have the opportunity to together build a future of work, build a future that is free of violence and harassment. And I think what Muhammad said about being patient in discussions and open, and I couldn't agree more. And I think that every day there are more people that are open to having that discussion and that are open to listening and also open to having that dialogue. And I'm incredibly optimistic. I'm an optimist. And I think that in our lifetime, we can achieve that reality where it's recognized as a right and respected as a right to not experience violence and harassment.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I know that you're hopeful. I am also hopeful, and I really hope that in our lifetime that we get to see that change. It'll be such a magical thing to look back and say, do you remember when we actually used to have these conversations? But here we are now, like not even having to worry about it. So thank you both. Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you, Erica, for such an amazing and insightful and really enriching conversation. I'm pretty sure that our online audience really had a time. And for those who will go back and listen to this and who will be listening to this even, beyond now, I really hope that you are inspired and that you feel empowered enough to stand up and to advocate against violence against women and girls, but also for you yourself to be an advocate for safe public spaces, because we are working towards a safe and bright future, and you are also a part of that movement. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night and stay tuned for the other conversations that will be coming up. Have a great night and be safe.